Welcome to Virtue Ethics. Today we're going to be looking at some of the objections that have been raised against attempts to formulate an account of right action in reference to or in a way that draws upon the virtues. And we're going to take as our kind of guide through a number of the objections an article by Raman Das. One of the things that I'll point you to in addition to Raman's piece is that there are some additional concerns that Lars Svensson considers in a paper that I assigned earlier in the semester. Another place you might look is at the canvas of different objections to virtue ethics that you can find in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on virtue ethics. And there is another objection to virtue ethics that you can find in a paper that's on the reading list on the Moodle called Is Virtue Ethics Self-Effacing? But today we're going to focus on a set of objections that get articulated by Raman Das in the paper that was assigned as reading for the course. Bear with me half a second while I pull up the slides for today's class. All right, so what we're going to be considering is a project articulated in a number of articles that Raman has published from around 2001 up to 2015. And the way that he formulates the objection in his 2015 paper, I think, is revealing in a number of respects regarding who his focus is and what the concerns are that he's raising against that focus of concern. Here's what Das says at the outset. He says, I shall assume that the essential feature of virtue ethical theory is that it evaluates action primarily, if not exclusively, in terms of inner states of character or motive. This way of formulating it is a way of answering the question, what makes a virtue ethic? And it can then stand alongside some of the other stories that we've considered regarding what's distinctive about virtue ethics. If we think of virtue ethics in this way, then Raman thinks there's a problem that's going to emerge fairly quickly. Here's his formulation of it. Whereas virtue ethics takes as theoretically basic an agent's internal states of character or motive, any plausible account of how a person should act must take into account features of the external world, notably including the act's foreseeable consequences. Accordingly, it would be surprising if right action could be understood entirely in terms of virtue, or indeed virtue entirely in terms of acting rightly. The focus of the concern that Das raises is that we're interested in internal states when we're thinking about the virtues. We're interested in external states of affairs when we're thinking about actions. And insofar as virtue ethics speaks primarily or exclusively to internal states, then how could it tell us about what we should do if external things also matter? But lest you be taken in by this particular worry, it's worth noticing how the worry might be articulated if we substitute in some of the other normative theories that are of interest to us. So let's take utilitarianism. It looks like the same kind of objection will be formulated against the utilitarian that Das is formulating against the virtue ethicist. Substituting for virtue ethics and virtues, the relevant terms from a utilitarian theory, we would end up with the following concern. Whereas utilitarianism takes as theoretically basic an agent's internal states, namely the states of pleasure and pain, any plausible account of how a person should act must take into account features of the external world. Accordingly, it would be surprising if right action could be understood entirely in terms of pleasure and pain. Or we can formulate the same kind of worry with respect to deontology. Whereas deontology takes as theoretically basic an agent's duties, any plausible account of how a person should act must take into account features of the external world, assuming that duties aren't features of the external world, but are instead features of conceptual space, perhaps, or features of the space of reasons, or what have you. Accordingly, it would be surprising if right action could be understood entirely in terms of duty. What we get then, if we look at the parallel between the objection that Das raises for the virtue ethicist and the version that we could raise for the utilitarian or the deontologist, is a reason to think maybe the internal-external objection isn't in fact doing the kind of work that Das thinks it can do. That maybe the contrast he's drawing is not the right place to be looking for a contrast to be drawn. One reason for resisting the kind of concern that Das is raising is that virtues involve internal and external features. So Hursthouse has been clear about this from the beginning. Back in a paper from 1984, where she's specifically focused on Aristotle's virtue ethics, she notes that virtue is concerned not just with internal states, but with actions and with feelings. And she's been consistent on this point up through one of her more recent interventions in the discussion, where she says a virtue is an excellent trait of character. It is a disposition to notice, expect, value, feel, desire, choose, act, and react in certain characteristic ways. So it looks as though what we get out of the kind of story that Das is articulating for us is we get an objection to a straw man. Nobody, Hursthouse or almost anybody else, thinks of the virtues just in terms of internal states. Instead, everybody who's influenced by Aristotle suggests that the virtues involve not just those internal states that Das highlights, but a range of other states as well, including actions and an attention to consequences when we get further down the line. So why exactly does Das think that this is the right place to draw the distinction? Well, he offers the following explanation. He says, I believe that sharply distinguishing moral character from right action is highly useful, indeed indispensable, in trying to understand and evaluate virtue ethics as a theoretically distinctive alternative to consequentialism, which defines right action in terms of producing good consequences, and in contrast to deontology, which defines it in terms of conformity to rules. In other words, Das thinks that in order to identify what's distinctive about a virtue ethic, we need to focus on something that separates virtue ethics off from all other theories. And he's suggesting that the thing that separates it off is a focus on internal states. There are some reasons for thinking that maybe this is an attractive way to go. And some of those reasons are suggested by one of the readings that we've done already, namely by some remarks that Gary Watson makes in The Primacy of Character. So Watson's language looks kind of like Das's language. He says, action appraisal is derivative from the appraisal of character on virtue ethical theory. Or, in the same context, the basic moral facts are facts about the quality of character. Moral facts about action are ancillary to these. In these remarks, Watson looks like he's making the same kind of distinction that Das is, drawing the lines in the same place. And as we'll see in a moment, we can get similar lines drawn in work by Michael Sloat. However, we've already seen other ways of drawing the distinction between a virtue ethical theory and other kinds of normative theory. You'll remember that Christine Swanton suggests that the virtues are central in the sense that conceptions of rightness, conceptions of the good life, conceptions of the moral point of view, and the appropriate demandingness of morality cannot be understood without a conception of relevant virtues. Notice that's a way of distinguishing between a virtue ethic and other kinds of normative theory that doesn't require us to make the internal-external distinction. Instead, what it says is virtues, whatever those are, and they can be the kinds of things that Hursthouse is talking about that involve how we feel and other internal states, as well as what we do. The crucial thing is that whatever our story about virtue is, it's going to, in some sense, be central. You can't understand key normative concepts without already having a conception of virtues. Or the way that I put it, virtues stand on the ground floor of the theory and are not defined in a way that makes virtue either subordinate or reducible to rightness or goodness. Even Roger Crisp, who is going to share some of the concerns that Doss has about virtue ethics, offers a way of drawing the distinction between virtue ethical theories and other normative theories that doesn't depend upon the internal-external distinction that most virtue ethicists are going to reject straight out of the gate. Crisp says, to be a form of virtue ethics, a theory must presumably make ineliminable reference to the virtues or to the virtuous person in its explanatory account of the ultimate right-making property or properties. In other words, there are other ways of distinguishing between virtue ethics and other normative theories than the one that Doss has formulated. Since Doss's formulation stands clearly at odds with anybody who takes their cue from either Aristotle or from Hume in the development of their virtue theory, then we've got good reason to think Doss is off on the wrong foot. Add to that the fact that it looks as though deontological theories and utilitarian theories are going to end up in exactly the same predicament, drawing the distinction where Doss does. And at the very least, the virtue ethicist would be in the same quandary that everyone else is. However, like I said, we've got useful ways of drawing the distinction between virtue ethical theories and other theories that don't depend on drawing the lines in the place that Doss does, and there are good reasons for preferring one of those over Doss's version of it. However, that's not the end of the list of objections that Doss raises. So let's carry on and look at other details of the argument he formulates. Doss suggests that we can start off in thinking about virtue ethics by looking at what he calls pure versions of virtue ethics. The first of these, what he calls pure actual agent virtue ethics, says an act is right if and only if it is well motivated. This is a formulation that should be familiar if you've read alternatives to Neo-Aristotelian virtue ethics. It should also be familiar if you were listening to Swanton's critique of the kind of theory that Michael Sloat articulates, because this is an articulation of Sloat's position. And Doss was a student of Sloat's when he was in graduate school. Another form of pure virtue ethics would be the formulation that we see in Rosalind Hursthouse's 1991 paper, which you read a few weeks ago. It says that an act is right if and only if it is what a virtuous agent would do in the circumstances. Doss calls this pure virtuous agent virtue ethics. Doss thinks that both Sloat's version and Hursthouse's version end up with a set of problems. The chief of these problems is that people occasionally act out of character. Even virtuous people occasionally act out of character. That looks like it's going to throw a monkey wrench into the works if what we're trying to do is appeal to the virtuous agent to define what it is that we ought to do. Because sometimes what the virtuous agent is doing isn't going to be in character, that is, isn't going to be in step with their virtues. And that will mean that we'll at best get morally indifferent advice, and at worst get pernicious advice. Furthermore, as Swanton was going to links to highlight, the virtuous person sometimes gets it wrong, out of ignorance or other causes. Furthermore, vicious people sometimes perform right actions. And it's always possible to do the right thing, but for the wrong reasons. If that's the case, then it looks as though the tie between right actions and motivations won't work, because sometimes people appear to perform the right action from the wrong motivation. And it looks as though the tie between right action and what the virtuous agent would do will end up similarly pointing us in the wrong direction, because virtuous people can get it wrong. So how might the virtue ethicist respond to these concerns? Well, Dawes suggests that they might weaken their formulation of the theory, or qualify the direct link between right action and moral character. If you're continuing with an agent-based story, then you can end up with a modified actual agent account. An act is right if and only if it exhibits or expresses a good motive. If you're working with a qualified agent story like Hursthaus's, then you can end up with a modified virtuous agent account. An act is right if and only if it is what a virtuous agent would characteristically, that is, acting in character, do in the circumstances. That's explicitly the way that Hursthaus formulates it in her 1996 paper. What each of these does is it provides a way for us to get around the worries that we were just looking at. Because instead of just looking at every action that the virtuous agent might do, we're just looking at the actions that the virtuous agent is performing when acting characteristically, that is, when acting in the virtuous way. Similarly, instead of just looking at right actions as actions that are motivated by the right kind of motivation, we'll get an action being right if it's the kind of action that expresses or exhibits, or at least could express or exhibit, a good motive. But against this move, Dawes suggests these modifications are each theoretically ad hoc. He goes on, they're a tacit confession that moral rightness sometimes does not conform to inner states of character or motive, and that even a fully virtuous person may act wrongly. Were it not for frequent exceptions to the rule, virtue ethicists could stick to pure versions of their preferred theory. However, I think that Dawes's objection doesn't go through. One reason to think it doesn't go through is it's not, in fact, ad hoc. Acknowledging that people do not always act in character isn't a confession that the virtue ethicist is making, nor is it a patch to fix a localized problem. It's something that has been central to the theory from its outset, because one of the significant features of virtue ethical theories historically, as well as contemporarily, is that they've been interested in representing our moral psychology in familiar and reasonably accurate ways. And among the familiar features of our moral psychology is the fact that people sometimes act out of character and act from at least motives that aren't transparent to themselves or even to bystanders. That means that the versions that Hursthaus is formulating and the modifications that we might make on Sleuth's behalf don't just give us a patch aimed at solving a problem. They give us something that's been central to the theory from the very beginning and is one of the things that the theory takes to be important, in contrast to what it takes are some of the abstract excesses of certain deontological theories and certain consequentialist theories. But if we're worried about the kinds of objections that are being formulated by Dawes, then we might modify the theories even further. We might move to a more abstract analysis of characteristically virtuous action. And that way we wouldn't have to just make a move that looks to Dawes ad hoc. There are three different versions of this that have been formulated in the literature that Doss considers. One is one suggested by Julia Driver. It suggests that what we should look to is what a fully virtuous person would advise. Michael Smith also entertains this as a possibility. A second version is one that gets articulated by Jason Kawal, and we find defended in Svensson's piece that you read earlier in the term. It thinks of right action in terms of what a fully virtuous person would approve of. And a third option, formulated by Valerie Tiberius, explains right action in terms of the reasons that would guide a fully virtuous person. Doss isn't happy with at least two of the three of these attempted modifications. Why not? Well, if we look at the advice version, often what a fully virtuous person would do or would advise in the circumstances differs from what an ordinary person should do. Take someone like John McEnroe, who was famed for his outbursts of temper on the tennis court. And imagine that a fictional version of John McEnroe has come to the end of a match that he's just lost, that he feels as though he's lost unjustly due to poor choices by the referees. At the end of the game, one might expect him to approach the net, were he a fully virtuous agent, and shake the hand of his opponent. It would be a show of good sportsmanship to do this. And so the fully virtuous person would go to the net. Similarly, the fully virtuous person might advise that the loser go to the net to shake the hand of the winner. But in McEnroe's circumstance, on this occasion, were he to go to the net and shake his opponent's hand, he'd probably not act in a sportsmanlike way. Instead, he might swing his racket at the head of his opponent. In that circumstance, it looks as though what the fully virtuous agent would do will lead to the wrong action. Similarly, what the fully virtuous agent would advise looks as though it's going to lead to the wrong action. If that's so, then what we get is a disconnect between either what the fully virtuous agent would do or what the fully virtuous agent would advise, and what the right action is in this circumstance for John McEnroe. But it looks as though appeal to what the fully virtuous person would characteristically approve of is capable of avoiding this worry, because the fully virtuous agent can still approve of going to the net and shaking hands, even if the fully virtuous agent wouldn't advise McEnroe to perform that action on this occasion, given the volatility of McEnroe's temper. How about Tiberius's reasons version? Well, Doss thinks this story is going to collapse into something that doesn't look like a virtue ethic. If we appeal to the reasons that would guide a fully virtuous person, it's no longer clear that the concept of virtue is doing any fundamental explanatory work. We ought to act in accordance with the reasons of the virtuous, not because they're the reasons a virtuous agent acts on, but because they're good reasons, Doss suggests. And so we can identify good reasons independently of an appeal to what the virtuous agent endorses. Why not then just do that? Why wheel in the virtuous person at all? So what Doss suggests is that Tiberius gives us a reasons-based rather than a virtue-based theory. There doesn't seem to be anything particularly virtue ethical about emphasizing the importance of practical reasoning. Everybody should be able to go in for practical reasoning, he suggests. Well, there are interesting concerns that one might raise about the role that reasons can have in a theory and the extent to which an appeal to reasons is consistent with formulating a virtue ethic. Nevertheless, I think there are moves that Tiberius can make to resist the objection Doss is formulating. Because if you think back to Utilitarianism and the Virtues, the paper by Foote that we read at the outset of the term, she suggests one way that a virtue ethicist might go in formulating an account that's reasons-based, but that still, in the end, requires virtue to be primary in some explanatory way in the theory. If we have to appeal to the perspective of virtue to identify what counts as a reason, and that's what suggests is the case, just like we have to appeal to the standpoint of the virtuous person, the benevolent one, to figure out what counts as a good state of affairs. Or if we have to appeal to the perspective of virtue to weigh those reasons against one another to determine what the action is on this occasion that we should do in light of conflicting reasons, then it would still be the case that virtue is doing fundamental explanatory work. And so one could formulate their theory in the way that Tiberius has, appealing to reasons, and still be offering a virtue ethical account. Let's turn then to a sixth objection that Das articulates, which is that virtue ethics is not action guiding. Why might one think virtue ethics isn't action guiding? Well, a number of people have been concerned that virtue ethics was concerned with being rather than doing. And some early virtue ethicists formulated their theories in these terms. If that's the case, then Das suggests we ought to part ways with the virtue ethicist. What is the point of an ethical theory that does not even pretend to be useful to a person trying to decide what he morally ought to do? I'm sympathetic to this worry, and you'll see me formulating a claim similar to this claim in Is Virtue Ethics Self-Effacing? Nevertheless, I think there are a couple of ways that the virtue ethicist can respond to this kind of concern so that it doesn't derail virtue ethics. One way of responding is just to reject the second claim that Das was just making and say an ethical theory need not be action guiding. Like I said, I'm sympathetic to his interest in an action guiding theory, but you might, like Lisa Van Zyl does, or like Linda Zagzebski does, say, look, when we're formulating an ethical theory, what we're interested in is the relationship between the various concepts that are in play. And we needn't think that our best formulation of the relationship between the concepts of virtue and right action and good outcome, etc., will be directly or immediately action guiding. If what we're engaged in is a theoretical exercise, then we can perform that theoretical function and leave it to somebody else, maybe the applied ethicist, to come along and help us figure out how that theory will trickle down into practice. But I think there's another response that we might make other than the, look, theory can come apart from practice response. And it's one that I hope you're already anticipating in light of having read Rosalind Hursthaus's Virtue Ethics and Abortion piece. Because we can appeal to V rules, and it looks like V rules can be extraordinarily action guiding. Do what is honest or charitable looks like it tells us the kind of thing to do in lots of circumstances. Do not do what is dishonest and uncharitable, that is, appealing to the vices. That also can help us guide our action. And so the action guiding objection, although it has been formulated a number of times, looks as though it has two robust kinds of response that might be offered to it. The seventh objection that Das articulates is the concern that virtue ethics is elitist and exclusionary. If you read through Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, he suggests that if you haven't been well trained and properly educated, there's no chance that you're going to be able to benefit from the kind of guidance or instruction that he offers in the book. Because what acting well requires is that one have been well habituated from an early age to care about the right kinds of things and to act in the right sorts of ways. So becoming a virtuous person is going to require a special kind of education, and it will require certain kinds of experiences in order to give us the knowledge that we need to decide in complex cases what ought to be done. And it looks as though it's going to require advanced cognitive abilities in order for us to be able to figure out in complicated circumstances what the virtuous action is going to be. After all, most virtue theorists think that we need practical wisdom, and practical wisdom isn't the sort of thing that's available to everybody. So if we're interested in a normative theory that is of use to everyone, then it looks as though the virtue ethicist isn't offering us that kind of theory. But in response to this concern, I think there are several things that virtue ethicists can say. One of them is just that ethics is hard. Nobody should be claiming that we can perform good actions easily. Nobody should be claiming that there's something that makes ethics, well, convenient or smooth or straightforward for everyone. It's just hard sometimes, not only to do the right thing, but to figure out what the right thing is, because the world is messy and the normative considerations that bear on our actions and choices are complicated and have to be weighed against one another. And that's not just a claim that the virtue ethicist is making. That's a claim that everyone is going to make. Consequentialists, in particular, often suggest that what we need is an ability to calculate outcomes that is actually not humanly possible. If so, then at the very least, the virtue ethicist isn't alone in making this claim. But I want to say further, the virtue ethicist is highlighting something that any normative theory should acknowledge, which is ethics shouldn't be expected to be easy. Sometimes it is. Often in ordinary, everyday garden variety circumstances, it is, because all of us have in fact been habituated to handle those kinds of circumstances reasonably well, or at least to recognize how we ought to handle those circumstances. But when it comes to the complicated cases, they should be complicated. We shouldn't pretend they're not. Furthermore, in response to the elitism objection, it's the case that we can appeal to the kind of distinction that Aristotle draws and that Foote and Swanton have both made much of in papers we read this term, namely the distinction between acting in accordance with virtue and acting from virtue. If I haven't been well habituated, then Aristotle says I can't act from virtue because I don't have virtue. But that doesn't mean I can't act in accordance with virtue. I could still perform the kind of action, understanding action now just in terms of external behaviors. I could perform the kind of action a virtuous agent would approve of in this context or advise or perform herself. I can perform the kind of action that will succeed in hitting the target of the virtue, to use Swanton's formulation, even if I don't act from virtue because I lack the trait in question. So the elitism worry doesn't look as though it applies, and the difficulty concern isn't a concern as far as the virtue ethicist is regarding the case. Instead, it's a feature rather than a bug. We can now turn to what is doing a lot of the heavy lifting in Doss's theory, which is that he thinks at the end of the day, we have need to appeal to concepts of rightness in order to articulate what the virtuous agent is and what the virtuous agent does. He says, although such theories purport to define right action in terms of the virtues, they end up relying crucially but circularly on the notion of rightness to explain what it is to be virtuous in the first place. So on Doss's account, the chief objection against virtue ethical theories is going to boil down to, we define virtuous persons in terms of right actions. Who's the virtuous person? It's the person who performs the right actions in these circumstances. Who's the benevolent person? Well, they're the person who performs the action of giving to someone who's in need when they have the means to do so. And that looks as though it's just appealing to a conception of rightness, that it's right for us to give to those in need in order to identify who the virtuous person is. If virtue is a disposition built up by making ethically right choices, then right appears to be explaining virtue, not the other way around, Das insists. How should we feel about this concern? Well, having read Jorge Garcia's paper, you should have a hunch as to how someone might begin to respond. We saw that Garcia offered several different reasons for being dissatisfied with attempts at defining virtue in terms of right action, because they leave out all kinds of things. But even if we're concerned not just with defining right action, but we're concerned with the kinds of actions somebody can perform because they've been habituated in the right way, which is the version of it that Das articulates on page 341. It nevertheless is the case that the virtue theorist has a rejoinder, which is that we can spell out what the actions are that one needs to perform in order to become habituated in terms of acting in accordance with the virtues. So we don't have to appeal to right actions. We can appeal to the V rules and related virtue concepts to formulate the kind of theory that the virtue ethicist is committed to. A ninth objection that Das articulates is that virtue ethics' conception of right action is ill-suited to address political problems and questions, answers to which depend largely on facts about the external world and very little on facts about an agent's inner states. So if you think that the virtue ethicist should be offering a complete theory of the normative that includes not just what an individual ought to do, but also includes what states and other institutions ought to do. In other words, if you think that a virtue ethical framework ought to be able to give a virtue politics as well as a virtue ethics, then if you're appealing to the internal workings of the virtuous agent, it looks like you are quite a long way from being able to tell us what it takes to make a good institution or a good law. The kind of theory that Das has chiefly in view is the theory that his former teacher offered. So you'll remember that Sloat offered a definition of just institutions and just laws that appealed to internal states. In earlier work, he puts it this way: agent-based virtue ethics moves consistently from inside out. That is why Das keeps thinking in terms of internal and external. It's because explicitly Sloat makes this move. But most other people aren't dependent on dividing the world up in that way and have thought that Sloat's way of dividing the world is inadequate. So even virtue ethicists are resisting this way of characterizing it. But leave that to one side. Sloat goes on. An agent-based virtue ethic bases its evaluations of actions on or in evaluations of the inner life of the individual, namely their motivations, and it also derives its evaluation of any given institution or society from its ethical judgments of the individuals in it, Sloat says. And so we will again be assessing their motivations. If all the virtue ethicist has to offer is that a good law or a just society is a society that a just person lives in or whose members are just people, or that the just law is the law that is passed by a well-motivated lawgiver, then I'm with Das in thinking there isn't much of a chance of a plausible virtue politics emerging. However, There are other approaches that can be taken. Most of these haven't been developed at any length, but there have been at least attempts to gesture in the direction that someone might move when working from virtue concepts. One way of doing this doesn't move directly from virtue to justice. Instead, it moves from virtue to conceptions that have become familiar in deliberative democracy, explaining why it is that the norms the deliberative democrat assumes are in fact important in terms of virtue states. So here's how I put it in a paper from 2008. An arrangement in which two virtuous agents deliberate together with the aim of determining their actions vis-a-vis one another, trying to figure out how they go on together, how they can live in harmony with each other. So an arrangement in which these agents deliberate together in a way of determining their actions vis-a-vis one another in a way that both approve is an arrangement the compassionate would regard favorably. Why would compassionate agents regard this favorably? Well, because doing that eschews coercion of the other party and involves attentiveness to the desires of both parties. In the same paper, I offer additional virtue-based reasons for seeing an arrangement in which the laws that we formulate are ones that everybody who might be affected by the laws can agree upon. And the output of that discussion is that we have at least one way of articulating a political theory that helps us identify what just laws and just institutions might look like in a way that makes an appeal to virtue concepts inescapable. An alternative version, the one that's been worked out in the most detail to this point, would be the capabilities approach that gets formulated by Martha Nussbaum. So in Nussbaum's account, she's working within a eudaemonist framework and suggests, as you remember, that there are these spheres of action that any well-lived life needs to navigate. And she suggests then that a state should aim at ensuring that in each of these spheres, people have the capabilities they require in order to flourish. So once again, we have an appeal to virtue-based concepts, flourishing, which will get unpacked in the way that eudaimonists want to unpack it, where virtues are going to be part of the ground floor, perhaps also in a way that naturalist eudaimonists would be interested in, looking at the nature of the human condition and the spheres of action or concern that every human being is going to encounter as a result of the biological social species that we are. And within that framework, we identify the things that matter in part by appealing to what flourishing looks like. Insofar as virtues in the ground floor of that, it too looks like it offers us a virtue politics. Note that the connection between virtue and the just institution or the just law isn't a direct connection, but we don't require a direct connection. What we require is just that virtue remains in the ground floor of the theory in a way that's not reducible to some other more primary normative concept. A 10th objection is that making virtue one's first or direct concern is very unlikely to be a good way to become virtuous. After all, shouldn't the virtuous person be focused not on themselves, but on other people and on the welfare of the people around them? Shouldn't they be directing their attention outward, in other words, rather than inward? Well, if you think back to Julia Annis's discussion of the egoism objection, you should already have ideas as to how to respond to this kind of worry. But we can highlight a mode of resisting the worry that is different than the one that Annis formulates. If we substitute for one's virtue, a particular virtue, So instead of thinking making virtue one's direct concern, what if we think making kindness one's direct concern? Does it seem crazy that making kindness one's direct concern is likely to be a good way to become kind? Well, I don't think so. I think being concerned with becoming kind could actually be really helpful in directing someone toward kindness and helping them figure out which actions are kind and helping them become habituated in performing those kinds of actions. Similarly, Anna suggests if I aim at living a good life, I'm aiming at being just and generous. And so we can substitute for kindness here justice or generosity. Making generosity one's direct concern is likely to be a good way of becoming generous. Making justice one's direct concern is likely to be a good way of becoming just. It won't work all on its own, of course. It's not necessarily going to be one's first concern in the way that Doss is suggesting in his objection. Nevertheless, it looks as though we can be directly concerned with it and it can yield the kind of outcome we're aiming at, namely people becoming more just, more generous, more kind, and the like. So I think this objection is an objection that gets its traction only because A, you've got the suspicion that there's something egoistic about virtue ethics still lingering in the background, and B, because Doss is thinking that what the virtuous agent's concerned with when they're thinking about virtues is some internal state. But we've already seen reason for rejecting that characterization of what a virtuous agent is interested in, the internal state one. And so we've got good resources for resisting that. And Ennis has already highlighted for us reasons for resisting the egoistic objection. If we turn our attention in the direction of a target-based theory or a target-centered theory, well, then we can have yet another kind of response to this worry, which is that what the virtuous person is going to be looking at are the targets of the virtues. And that's going to draw our attention to the very kinds of things that the best people acting in the best ways would be concerned with. In other words, I think that none of the objections that has been formulated in Doss's theory, in Doss's article, are adequate to undermine the virtue ethicist's position. They're all objections worth considering, and they all can be used to help us refine the theory and make the theory more precise and articulate it more clearly so as to avoid certain kinds of misunderstanding. But none of them succeeds in ruling out a virtue ethical approach as an approach altogether. That's not to say that there aren't objections that might be wheeled out that might lead us to seriously reconsider virtue ethic and whether one can be formulated, or whether at the end of the day the conception of virtue collapses into some other conception that is more primary. It's just to say that these objections that Doss and a number of others have formulated aren't the kinds of objections that spell out the end of the theoretical road for the virtue ethicist. There's one other kind of objection that has been formulated that Doss doesn't articulate, but that gets explored in the last reading assigned for the semester. Namely, it's the situationist objection. And it's an objection that doesn't just focus on whether or not we can formulate an account in which virtue is primary. It's an objection that asks whether we can reasonably, meaningfully talk about virtues at all, whether the concern with a realistic moral psychology that has been part and parcel of most virtue ethical theories from Aristotle onward is in fact going to give us anything that looks like a virtue to work with, or whether there are reasons to doubt that anybody has the virtues, that the virtues are the kind of thing that exist at all. The objection is what's known as the situationist objection, and it emerges from recent work in social psychology. So as you're thinking about your second essay and what you might wish to write on and the kinds of objections that you might consider, whether you're focusing on the second part of the class, looking specifically at how we understand the virtues and what the best account of virtue is, or whether you're concerned with the third part of the class in your essay, namely how we formulate a normative theory that takes virtues to be explanatorily primary, the situationist objection is an objection that can pull the brakes on either one if it ends up being a successful concern. So I encourage you to have a look at the situationist chapter from Liesel van Zyle's book, and we can think about whether or not the situationist challenge is a challenge the virtue ethicist or the virtue theorist, either one, can respond to. All right, we'll end today's discussion there, and I'll leave you to go and look at Van Zyle's paper and think about the situationist challenge. And I'll look forward to seeing which of the different bits or pieces of the class you focus on in your second essay. Hopefully we'll have finished the moderating process soon. One of the moderators is working his way through a very large stack of first year essays, and so hasn't had a chance to look at your essays yet, but we should be able to look at those very, very soon so that we can get feedback to you at a timely point so that you can still make beneficial use of it in your last essay. Hope you guys are all looking after yourselves. I'll look forward to seeing you again soon. So long.